second of our series of talks on Aquinas and the future of Christian thought. When we think of Aquinas, there are lots of lenses through which we might offer an assessment of his life. Professor, preacher, theologian, philosopher, but also a priest. And as we look for a renewal of the priesthood in our time, I think the thoughts of St. Thomas can instruct us very deeply about the meaning and significance of the priesthood and the way in which we might integrate it into our intellectual lives and our quest for the truth. Leading us this evening in our consideration is Father Reginald Lynch, who is Assistant Professor of Systematic and Historical Theology at the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C. Father Reginald took his doctorate at Notre Dame, specializing in medieval theology, and he's published extensively on the thought of St. Thomas, its reception throughout history, especially in the early modern period, and has explored Aquinas in his relationship with other thinkers, including Anselm and Augustine, but ranging right through to contemporary continental philosophers. His first book was published in the Thomistic Ressourcement series by CUA, Cleansing of the Heart, exploring the sacraments as instrumental causes in St. Thomas's thought. And he's recently completed a volume on the reception of Aquinas's understanding of Eucharistic sacrifice in the early modern period. And tonight's talk is entitled Thomas Aquinas on the Priesthood, Temple, Allegory, and the Humanities of Christ. Please join me in welcoming Father Reginald Lynch.
Well, thank you very much, Father Oliver, for that very generous introduction. It's such a pleasure to be with you all this evening. I'm particularly grateful to Father Keenan and the Aquinas Institute here for their generous invitation to participate and to give this lecture. And I'm thankful, of course, as well to the Dominican community and the student body here as well for their generous hospitality. The title of this lecture is Thomas Aquinas on the Priesthood, Temple, Allegory, and the Humanities of Christ. So in this lecture, I will examine Aquinas' approach to the concept of priesthood and its place in the economy of salvation, drawing upon Aquinas' systematic presentation of Christ's priesthood and sacramental priesthood within the Church, as well as the figural representation of these incarnational and ecclesial realities within the liturgical world of the Old Covenant. Theologically considered, Aquinas' notion of priesthood in the Church begins with Christ, and then extends to the members of the Church in baptism, and in a special sense to those who receive the sacrament of orders. In the case of both Christ himself and the Church's membership, however, the concept of priesthood is fundamentally associated with human nature, and the mediation needed between humanity and God. Beginning with his treatment of Christ's priesthood in the Tertia Pars, in the first part of this lecture, I will explore the broader systematic context in which Aquinas' account of Christ's priesthood should be understood, focusing in particular on the necessity of Sacra Doctrina and the Incarnation for the salvation of human nature, and the specific capacity of human nature for sacrificial and ultimately priestly actions in relation to God. Following this, in the second section of this talk, I will examine the figural role of Christ's priesthood under the Mosaic Law, and its implications for the relationship between Christ's priesthood and the people of God in the context of the liturgy more generally. Although the Church now lives in the full reality of what was only foreshadowed in the Old Law, Aquinas' description of the figurative sense of this law, which is surprisingly rich, gives us a picture of the full ecclesial implications of Christ's priesthood in relation to the people that enhances the understanding of this connection that Aquinas implies within his systematic treatment of Christ's priesthood and of sacramental priesthood in the Church that he develops in the Tertia Pars. Lastly, in the third and final section of this lecture, I will return within the Church, exploring the baptismal priesthood and the ordained priesthood in relation to the priesthood of Christ and in relation to each other. In each of these three sections, the divinizing relationship between the assumed humanity of Christ and the humanity of those who participate in his body will be a governing principle. Because Christ is a priest, something foreshadowed in the old law and in the law of nature itself is fulfilled, and the image of God is restored in the rational creature who bears his image. So, the first section, Christ's priesthood. In the first article of question 22 of the Tertia Pars, Aquinas offers a general definition of the priesthood in the context of his description of the priesthood of Jesus Christ. Quote, "The office proper to a priest is to be a mediator between God and the people." End quote. For Aquinas, this takes the form of bestowing divine gifts on the people. In this sense, playing on the etymology of the Latin word sacerdos, a priest can be understood as a giver of sacred things, a sacra dans, who bestows divine things on the people. In another sense, the priest offers up the prayers of the people to God and makes satisfaction for their sins. Taking these definitions as his point of departure, Aquinas argues that the office of the priest is most fittingly attributed to Christ, because it is through Christ that we receive divine things. Referencing 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 4, Aquinas clarifies that the divine things in question are in fact a participatory share in the divine nature. Perhaps surprisingly, for Aquinas it is the divinization of the human person that demarcates the divine things given to the people of God through the priesthood of Christ. As a participatory reality, for Aquinas, this share of the divine nature also corresponds to the reconciling function of the priesthood, precisely because it is through Christ that the Father reconciles all things to himself. And here he refers to Colossians chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. Although this definition of priesthood, as a mediator between God and the people who bestows holy things, can be applied more broadly, in this context it is clear that Aquinas intends to frame the priestly identity of Christ within the wider ratio of salvation history and the redemption of the human person. At the outset of the Tertia Pars, Aquinas offers a series of arguments for the fittingness of the Incarnation that reflect and build upon his arguments for the fittingness of divine revelation itself and of the salvation that comes from it, which he articulates at the outset of the Summa in the prologue to the Prima Pars. Although God is neither compelled to redeem human nature or to do so in any certain way, in the first question of the Summa, Aquinas argues that the revelation of a knowledge of God that surpasses all human science is necessary for human salvation. For Aquinas, it is the conditions of human nature itself that indicate the need for this revelation. Although directed to God as end, human reason is unable to grasp God in himself. Despite the partial capacity of philosophy and of other human sciences to know God under a certain aspect, these efforts are of their nature incomplete, and all too often marked with a degree of error. Aquinas therefore argues that in addition to these human rational endeavors, the human person needs to be taught divine truths by means of God's own revelation. This need for so-called sacra doctrina, or the teaching regarding holy things, is the ratio, Aquinas argues, that motivates the unfolding structure of the Summa Theologiae as an account of God, of creation and of recreation, according to the order of these realities themselves. Building on his initial description of the human person's salvific need for sacra doctrina at the outset of the Summa, therefore, in the Secunda Pars, Aquinas describes in greater detail the nature and finality of the human person and the divinization of the human person in grace. Following this, in the Tertia Pars, Aquinas describes the means by which this divinization is accomplished. Building on the more general ratio of sacra doctrina itself, for Aquinas the Incarnation is the most fitting means by which the salvation of the human person may be accomplished. His argument for this, in the first question of the Tertia Pars, builds again on the nature of the human person. Aquinas argues that, because of the epistemic character of the human person as not only rational but hylomorphic, it is fitting that the invisible things of God, those holy things contained in the science of sacra doctrina, that these should be communicated and made known through visible things. Aquinas reminds us that this visible communication of the invisible things of God is in fact the original purpose of the created world, which reveals the transcendental goodness and truth of the divine nature through sensible signs. Following this same pattern, for Aquinas, the mystery of the Incarnation makes known at once the goodness, wisdom, justice, and power of God, this time in a supernatural key. Following Dionysius, Aquinas argues that it was most fitting for God to join himself to a created human nature so that he might communicate his goodness in its highest form to creatures. The incarnate Christ, therefore, is a single person in which the eternal Word is united to a human soul and flesh. In Aquinas' broader account of divine revelation and of the Incarnation, human nature and its relationship with and need for the divine plays an important role. As a structural component of the Summa Theologiae as a whole, the Tertia Pars stands as a completion and a fulfillment of the exploration of Sacra Doctrina that Aquinas begins at the outset of this same text. The study of Christ, which appears at the outset of the Tertia Pars itself, is in fact the first of three planned divisions of this final section of the Summa. Beginning with the mystery of the Incarnation, the Tertia Pars would then progress, in Aquinas' original plan, to consider the sacraments as Christological instruments of sanctification, finally concluding with a treatment of eschatology and of last things. Although Aquinas did not complete the final sections of this project before his death, his initial design of these closing sections of the Summa make it clear that the structural orientation of the text remains focused on the salvation and divinization of human nature. In this sweeping account of the return of the creature to the Creator, of the image to the exemplar, Aquinas' treatment of the hypostatic union of Christ's divine and human natures stands not only as an exemplar of the life of grace that we participate in ourselves, but as a foreshadowing of the consummation of all things in the goodness of God. In this Christological context, Christ's priesthood falls within a specific aspect of his broader treatment of the humanity that Christ assumes and the consequences of that union. After considering what is assumed essentially by Christ in taking on a full human nature, Aquinas goes on to consider the degree to which the human nature Christ assumed was perfected in its intrinsic capacities by this union, the so-called co-assumed aspects of the Incarnation, to use Aquinas' language. And then, following this, the extrinsic human actions and historical activities of Christ during his earthly life, which culminate, of course, in the cross. Aquinas' consideration of Christ's priesthood, which appears in question 22 of the Tertia Pars, is situated ostensibly within his treatment of the so-called consequences of the perfection of human nature. In this section, Aquinas first explores the implications of the assumptions for the human nature itself, drawing our attention to the way in which the assumed human nature is perfected in grace. Beginning with the grace of the hypostatic union itself, Aquinas explores the perfection of Christ's own humanity and grace as an individual man, and then the grace by which his humanity is further perfected in his role as head of the Church, related to the graced human natures of the mystical body, of the members of his mystical body. As co-assumed perfections, these graces of union, of personal grace and ecclesial headship, each perfect the human nature assumed by the person of the Word in distinct ways, each of which identifies a specific aspect of the perfective consequences of the hypostatic union for Christ himself as the God-man. Although these perfections speak of different aspects of the intrinsic perfection of the human nature assumed, it would be inaccurate to claim that these same perfections exhaust the whole of the Incarnation's teleology. Indeed, for Aquinas, the Incarnation finds its completion in Christ's work on our behalf, most especially his passion. Following his treatment of the co-assumed perfections of Christ's human nature, therefore, Aquinas turns his attention to the consequences of the hypostatic union. It is here that Aquinas situates the priesthood of Christ. In his initial treatment of the incarnation, it is clear that the human nature that Christ assumes is perfected and divinized in a super-excellent manner. For Aquinas, this superabundant perfection has consequences, however, for the relationship between Christ and the Father. Considered in his divinity as the eternal Word, Christ already stands in a certain relation with the Father. As an equally divine person of the Trinity according to essence, the person of the Word proceeds eternally from the Father and is subsistently distinguished from the same according to the eternal pattern of the mutually opposed relations of paternity and filiation. As Father and Son, the first and second persons of the Trinity are distinguished by a form of relationality that stands outside the created order entirely. The arc of Sacra Doctrina, however, concerns the redemption of the Trinity's image, as found uniquely in created rational creatures. Taking to himself the volitionally malleable, and therefore redeemable, instance of created rational nature that is unique to the materially subsistent human soul, the person of the Word adopts a fitting instrument for the redemption of those creatures who, by the adoption of grace themselves, will come to share a deepened similitude of nature with the Word by the working of grace. What changes as a result of the incarnation, therefore, between the Father and the Son? Certainly not the eternal relations that distinguish the Father and Son as Trinitarian persons within the one God. As a consequence of the incarnation, however, the God-man stands in a new relation with the Father. For Aquinas, this relation is Christ's priesthood. Returning to question 22 of the Tertia Pars, which supplied the initial definition of priesthood that was invoked at the outset of this lecture, we find that Christ's humanity serves as a most fitting mediator between God and the people. Although angels stand between God and human persons in the order of being, the incarnate Christ emerges as greater than the angels, not only according to his Godhead, but in his humanity as well, which possesses the full measure of grace and glory. In the context of the broader structure of the Tertia Pars, it is because of the perfection and grace of Christ's human nature, including both assumed and co-assumed perfections, that this same humanity is, by consequence, most fittingly related to the eternal Father as a priest. In Christ, the capacities of lawgiver, priest, and king, in others distributed to different individuals, concur in Christ for Aquinas, as a function of his exemplarity as the head of the body in grace and of all human persons in the order of excellence. For Aquinas, the exemplarity of Christ's priesthood stands as the fulfillment of a multitude of types present in human cultures and most especially in salvation history. Considered essentially, human nature has an intrinsic religious orientation for Aquinas under the auspices of the virtue of justice. As a potential part of justice, the virtue of religion has to do with the right relation of the human person to God. Specifically, as a virtue, religion represents the subjugation of the mind to God, by which we offer God fitting praise. In the Secunda Secundae, Aquinas describes a connected matrix of both internal and external acts that comprise the proper expression of this same virtue. Beginning with the interior acts of devotion and prayer, the external acts of religion function as visible signs of the interior ones, taking the form of bodily reverence, sacrifices, oblations, and first fruits, tithes, and vows. In Aquinas' description of the consequences of the incarnation in the Tertia Pars, an echo of this basic anthropological pattern emerges in his presentation of the new relation with the Father that results from the incarnation. Beginning with the subjection of Christ to the Father in his humanity, it follows that Christ also performs the second internal act of the virtue of religion, which is prayer, as subjected to the Father. His priesthood follows from this for Aquinas, following broadly the trajectory of the external acts of the virtue of religion in which bodily acts of worship culminate in sacrifice. For Christ, this will be the cross itself. In relation to human nature considered essentially, therefore, the priesthood of Christ has an exemplary function that offers to elevate and perfect all human persons and cultures that are drawn to him. For the Salamancan Dominican tradition, for example, this aspect of Christ's priestly office was particularly generative. Vittoria, Soto, and Bañez all begin their descriptions of Christ's priesthood and the Eucharist using the virtue of religion, working to show that these theological themes are conceptually grounded in the human person's relation to God under natural law. So the second section, Christ as high priest, temple incarnation, and the space of true sacrifice. Within the more specific context of salvation history, Christ's priesthood also stands as an exemplar, however, fulfilling in truth the figures of priestly ministry found under the law of Moses. Here again, a pattern of anthropological fulfillment emerges within the context of divine positive law, in which the priesthood of Christ is identified as a supernatural fulfillment of the religious teleology of the human person under natural law. In the specification of positive law, the specific ceremonial patterns within the natural teleology of the virtue of religion, personally and socially considered, emerge as a space within the created order for the right worship of God, to the exclusion of idolatry and other dystelic expressions of the human religious impulse, even as these same ceremonial practices foreshadow the spiritual and supernatural fulfillment of this same impulse in the priestly function of the humanity of Christ. Although some have implied that the bulk of Aquinas' theology of the priesthood is found exclusively in question 22 of the Tertia Pars, to the exclusion of the rest of the Summa, I would argue, in this case, that that is not entirely representative of Aquinas' thought. Although the eminent scholar Jean-Pierre Terrell has minimized, at least to a certain extent, the importance of the figurative dimension of the Old Law for Aquinas' understanding of Christ's priesthood, I would respectfully propose here that there are in fact many important conceptual resources within these texts which should not be overlooked. What is described as figure in the context of the Old Law is a lived reality for the Church at present. Accordingly, in this context, the figure serves not only as an anticipation of the reality, but as an indication of the form and scope of the reality itself, even as it exists in the present. In this vein, in his treatment of the ceremonial precepts of the Old Law, Aquinas identifies several important features of Christ as priest in relation to the members of the Church and even human nature itself that remain instructive for our understanding of these topics today. In question 102 of the Prima Secundae, Aquinas argues that Christ's priesthood is the fulfillment of the figurative sense of the ceremonial precepts of the Old Covenant. Falling within his treatment of law more generally, Aquinas approaches the liturgical precepts of the Mosaic Covenant as a species of divine positive law. Taken in their literal sense, these ceremonial precepts have a proper function within the historical context in which they were originally given. As religious observances, these precepts aid in the fruitful exercise of the virtue of religion by clearly specifying external religious acts that both give honor to God and avoid the error of idolatry. In their literal sense, they differ from the natural law only in the specificity that characterizes positive law. Their letter alone does not provide the pattern for a supernatural teleology for human religious acts, taken in and of itself. As a median point in the trajectory of salvation history, however, these same observances also foreshadow Christ's priesthood in their figurative sense. Following the exegesis of Venerable Bede and the medieval monastic tradition, Aquinas argues that the liturgical precepts of the Old Law are in fact mystical figures of both Christ and the Church. For Aquinas, the sacrifices of the Old Law in particular signify the sacrifice of Christ. As imperfect representations of a perfect reality, their frequency and the comparative powerlessness in face of sin reflect their status as figures of the priestly sacrifice of Christ. For Aquinas, the Holocaust sacrifice in particular, in which the entirety of the offering is consumed, represents the most perfect form of sacrifice, serving as a type of Christ's self-offering on the cross. Additionally, however, this same consumptive offering foreshadows a broader anthropological principle that becomes a reality in the context of the Church's life as a participation in Christ's human nature. After the incarnation, the supernatural perfection of charity emerges as a teleological possibility for the human person whose humanity has been sanctified by participating in Christ's body in grace. Understood figuratively, the Holocaust offering not only represents the perfection of Christ's own sacrifice, but of the self-offering of those in whom the infused virtue of charity has come to perfect and direct all of their thoughts and actions. In this context, Aquinas mentions religious life as an example of a state of life in which within the Church that is specifically committed to this end. Using two other forms of sacrifice found under the law of Moses, however, the sin offerings and peace offerings, Aquinas also sees a figure of the progressively more perfect offering of the Church in these partially consumed offerings. In these offerings, sin offerings and peace offerings, in which the thing offered is not entirely consumed, Aquinas sees the beginning of the fulfillment of a basic human obligation to give thanks to God according to a threefold pattern that recalls again the teleological progression of the virtue of religion. Beginning with an acknowledgement of the human person's dependence on the majesty of God, this pattern progresses to include the human debt to God that results from personal and collective sin. Finally, in the most perfect form of sacrifice, the human person expresses gratitude for God for both present and future benefits received. As a foreshadowing of the new law, in Aquinas' view, the old law contains within it an implicit Christological structure that reveals itself in the specific liturgical ceremonies of the old law. In the progression from the movable tabernacle to the fixed temple in Jerusalem, following Bede again and other medieval theologians, Aquinas sees a twofold allegory. In one sense, a progression from the old law to the new. In another sense, however, a distinction within the life of the Church itself between the fluctuation and change of the present age of the life of the Church and the final stability of the eschatological state of the same Church. By emphasizing the unity between temple and tabernacle under the old law, Aquinas also understands the ritual exclusion found in the literal sense of the ceremonial precepts proper to each space, both temple and tabernacle, of those forms of improper worship that did not give fitting honor to God according to the threefold perfection of sacrificial offerings outlined above. In this literal sense, pagan ceremonies and even merely secular pursuits are excluded from the ritual space that the tabernacle and temple mutually represent within the social fabric of the people of God. For Aquinas, taken again in their literal sense, the unity of tabernacle and temple further represents a unified ritual space in which right sacrifice is offered to God alone, excluding not only according to physical space, but also ceremonial intent, the multiplicity of imperfect and false sacrifices offered by the surrounding pagan religions. Under the Old Covenant, the unity of Abrahamic faith is mirrored in the unity and ritual exclusivity of this liturgical space. As a figure of the new law, however, this ceremonial and creedal unity stands as a foreshadowing not so much of the physical liturgical space of Christian churches, as it is a figure of the unity of authentic sacrifice and true worship that is found in the priesthood of Christ as the fulfillment of Abraham's faith. In the new law, however, it is the spiritual life of grace that provides the space that, under the old law, was occupied by the physicality of the tabernacle and of the temple. As high priest and head of the church, Christ exercises his priesthood within the ecclesial unity of the church. As an allegory of the church, therefore, the temple space itself provides a further figurative image of the church as a unified space of sacrifice, divided between the Holy of Holies, found in the western portion of the temple, the sanctuary in the eastern portion, and then an outer court bordering both of these sections of the temple. Aquinas identifies two spiritual readings. In the first, the distinction between sanctuary and the Holy of Holies represents the division between the physical and corporeal world and the world of spiritual substances. Following Augustine, Aquinas indicates that this division between corporeal and spiritual is mediated by a veil of visible signs. Following Bede again, Aquinas sees the veil shrouding the Holy of Holies as representing the elements of the material world, which yield to the world of spiritual things when approached as signs. As legitimate spaces of the one unified temple, Aquinas argues that each of these spaces, corporeal and spiritual, offer different forms of worship. For Aquinas, the figurative significance of the temple as a liturgical space is in fact an allegory for the Christological structure of the church and Christ as head of the body, unified as a worshiping whole under the one priesthood of Christ. Under the old law, the priests would enter the sanctuary of the temple on a daily basis, while the people would remain in the outer court. The veil which separated the corporeal from the spiritual, however, was transgressed only once annually by the high priest. For Aquinas, the entrance of the high priest into the Holy of Holies represents the sacrificial perfection of the human person. Following the pattern Aquinas has detailed earlier, this means progressing from the sacrificial obligations of the natural law and the subsequent recognition of the further debt of sin to a sacrifice of thanksgiving. Turning to the letter to the Hebrews, Aquinas offers another interpretation of the liturgical space of the Solomonic temple, interpreting the division between the sanctuary and the Holy of Holies as a figure of the relationship between the old law and the new. While a multitude of priests offered a multitude of sacrifices under the old law, in the new dispensation, Christ fulfills in truth what the high priest's entrance into the Holy of Holies represented only in figure, bringing with him into this space of spiritual worship the members of his body who share, in the context of his priesthood, a spiritual life that is in anticipation of the life of heaven. In this understanding, Christ's passage through the veil, which Hebrews describes, alters the relationship of the human person to the spiritual realities contained behind the veil. In the literal observance of these ceremonial precepts within the physical space of the temple, the veil served to differentiate the bodily nature of human existence and life from the possibility of a form of worship based not in bodily, but in spiritual realities. In the context of the Incarnation, the role of the veil itself shifts, revealing itself not as an obstacle to spiritual worship, but as an instrument by which true spiritual worship takes place. Signs, of their nature, reposition material things to point beyond themselves toward unseen realities. In the Tertia Pars, Aquinas will use an adapted version of Augustine's doctrine of signs to describe the sacramentality of the Incarnation and its effects as a repositioning of the material in relation to the spiritual that begins with the humanity of Christ and extends to the humanity of those who share in his body. However, much of Aquinas' understanding of this Christological reality can be seen in figure in his spiritual interpretation of the liturgical space of the temple and its usage. In the case of the veil specifically, Aquinas argues that each of its four colors represents a different aspect of the sacramental transformation of the church that results from the mediation of Christ as high priest. Beginning with the bodily aspect of human life, the first two of the veil's four colors signify purity of the flesh and the suffering of the saints. Subsequently, the spiritual and immaterial dimensions of human teleology are sacramentally transformed, first in the love of both God and neighbor, and finally in the contemplation of heavenly things themselves. Recalling the first section of this lecture, where we discussed the grammatical normativity of religion as a pattern for divinely oriented human action, the beatific end of the human person, and the necessity of Sacra Doctrina, in the context of the temple space and the intermediary veil, more specifically, we see a foreshadowing of the sacramental and divinizing implications of Christ's priesthood, which creates, within the sacramentality of the incarnation, a space for the right worship of God under the headship of Christ, giving thanks for benefits already received and for those expected in the life to come. It is in this space of Christ's humanities, his assumed human nature and ours, united to his by grace, that this new sacramental reality emerges as the life of the Church. As a Christo-ecclesial allegory, I have argued that Aquinas' figurative understanding of the physical space of the temple and its ceremonies provide a special image for understanding the role of Christ's priesthood in the contemporary context of the Church. But how are we to situate the members of the present-day Church in relation to the images of ecclesial space that Aquinas identifies in the temple? Aquinas has made it clear that the physicality of the temple and its special subdivisions has been definitively transferred to the life of grace. Recall, however, that this same spatial organization of the temple was divided between clerical, itself subdivided between high priest and priests at large, and lay, the clerical group occupying the inner spaces of the sanctuary and Holy of Holies, while the non-clerics remained outside in the temple court. To what extent is the original physicality of the spaces of the Temple of Solomon determinative for the polity of the Church in relation to Christ? In one reading, the people, precisely because of their non-clerical status, seem to be confined to an outer space of the temple that is far removed from the spiritual realities contained within the Holy of Holies. While this physical division of space certainly governed the ceremonial precepts of the Old Law in their literal sense, it is not clear that Aquinas means for these divisions between clerical and lay states of life to be transferred into the figurative sense of these liturgical precepts. Although the temple and its different liturgical spaces continues to provide an allegorical image of the Church, we have already learned from Aquinas that the progressive perfection of sacrifices under the Old Law, from sin offerings and peace offerings, finally to Holocaust offerings, was representative of the progression of spiritual sacrifices in the context of grace. Recall that in Aquinas' understanding, the figurative significance of the physical space of the temple was transferred to the spiritual life of grace. The progression from imperfect to more perfect sacrifice, therefore, will be tied definitively to the figure of the high priest, who alone transgresses the threshold of the Holy of Holies, passing through the veil of material signs to worship God in spiritual realities. To the third section of the talk, Beyond the Veil, the Incarnational Humanity of the Church and the Life of Grace. Within the context of the letter of the Old Law, we have already seen that the progressive perfection of the worship of God from within the human condition is figuratively shown to have its fulfillment in the priestly headship of Christ, whose passage beyond the veil, as it were, yields the possibility of worshiping the one God in spirit and in truth. Taking the liturgical space of the temple as an allegorical foreshadowing of the reality of the Church's life, we have seen that the structure of this liturgical space provides a figure of the relationship between the worship of God under the physicality of visible things, the spiritual worship of Christ as high priest, and the mediating signs that stand between these two realities, figured in the liturgical space of the temple in the multicolored veil. Returning to Aquinas' description of the reality that fulfills these figures in the tertia pars of the Summa, the fittingness of both the Incarnation and, more broadly, Sacra Doctrina itself outline the ratio for the use of material and visible things as an intermediary space between material and immaterial realities. For Aquinas, both the assumed and co-assumed perfections of Christ's humanity form a conjoined instrument of sanctification, of which the Church's sacraments are separated instrumental extensions, that provides the means by which the soteriologically necessary truth of Sacra Doctrina, the holy things communicated by Christ as High Priest, are given to the human person, not only as the material content of belief, but as the formal means by which the divine essence is made the final end and governing formality of deified human activity, beginning in baptism and sanctifying grace with Trinitarian indwelling, and finding its rest in the supreme happiness of the beatific vision. I have argued elsewhere that the life of the human person within the reality of sanctifying grace resembles a form of instrumentality, as their progressively deified humanity comes to resemble the elevation of both Christ's humanity and the material elements of the sacraments as instrumental causes of sanctification. Because it implies a formal qualitative change in the essence of the soul and in the soul's end, in the case of the sanctified human person, grace has the effect of amplifying the analogy of being itself, according to both essence and end. The image of the veil, therefore, that Aquinas invokes as a figure in the context of the ceremonial precepts of the Old Law is fulfilled in the context of the Church, in both the humanity of Christ and his sacraments, and in the humanity of the one who participates in Christ's body as a member of the Church. As we have seen, the imagery of this veil, as a feature of the liturgical space of the temple, forms an important image of Christ's priesthood and its sacramental context in the life of the Church. However, despite the importance that Aquinas attaches to the space of the temple as a figure of the Church, and, as I have argued here, the humanities of Christ, Aquinas also proposes a deeper figure, still within the context of the Old Testament, for the fulfillment of human nature by the priesthood of Christ, using the concept of the altar itself. For Aquinas, it is the altar of sacrifice within the temple that forms a unitive principle in Aquinas' understanding of the Christological fulfillment of these same ceremonial figures. For Aquinas, the altar itself, as described in Exodus 20, is itself a foreshadowing of the Incarnation and the priestly offering that follows from it. Although the altar in the temple was likely made of bronze, as Exodus indicates, it is most preferable that an altar not be constructed even of stones or located on a high place, a reference, no doubt, to pagan shrines of the time. Rather, the altar should be made from earth itself and should not include ascending steps of stone or any other material. For Aquinas, the earthen altar, which was described under the previous covenant as the most perfect means of sacrifice, foreshadows the humanity of Christ. As true flesh assumed in the Incarnation by the eternal Word and hypostatically united to the divine nature, the comparative lowliness of a created human nature is made equal to the Father. Because of this union, no further steps, as it were, or other means of ascent besides this assumed created nature itself, is necessary to achieve this equality with the divine nature. Implicitly, what makes his humanity an altar in this context is that it forms the space in which a sacrifice is performed by Christ, not for himself, but for others. Recall that for Aquinas, although the priesthood of Christ is situated in his human nature, it is not the union itself as such, as the nature assumed or as co-assumed, but rather as a consequence of this union that concerns the relationship between Christ's assumed humanity and the eternal Father that is named priestly. As a priest, the earth of Christ's humanity forms an altar of sacrifice, a space of true worship in the Spirit, in which our humanity comes to be included as well. Continuing his figurative commentary on the altar of the temple, Aquinas reminds us that because the nature assumed by Christ is ours, the altar made from our humanity extends something of the co-equality of the eternal Word with the Father to us. Although clearly not equal to the Father in essence, created human nature has the capacity to draw closer to the divine nature through participation. In the Prima Pars, Aquinas uses the language of image and similitude to explain this analogical relationship. A father and his son are definitionally related by similitude of nature. In the case of the eternal Son, he is the most perfect image of the Father, because he proceeds from the Father according to a perfect similitude of species. Although personally distinct, the Father and the Son share equally in the divine nature. In the case of created human nature, both Christ's and our own, the image of divinity is said less perfectly. While the image of a king is found in his Son by similitude of nature, a different nature may also serve as an image of the king, such as a coin that bears the visage of the same sovereign. It is in this second sense that human nature is named an image of God, as something that expresses imperfectly the divine nature. In this context, however, Aquinas adds an important point of precision to the notion of image in the context of created human nature. Although the eternal Word is the perfect image of the Father by virtue of their mutual divinity, for created human nature to image the same divinity, a teleological orientation of the person is necessary towards the same divine nature, within the rational creature's capacity for perfection in second act. Aquinas describes the divine image in the coin of human nature as, quote, towards the image, precisely because in the context of grace, human nature exhibits a movement toward perfection as an image of God. In the case of Christ, this perfectibility has already brought to full act in the assumed and co-assumed dimensions of Christ's humanity and in the consequences of this union. Christ's humanity is alive in grace in the fullest sense, and as a consequence of this, his priesthood is the perfected exemplar in which all other priests participate. As a more general description of the effects of grace on created human nature, the perfectibility of humanity as image, a coin bearing the visage of the king, serves to contextualize the more specific picture of humanity as an earthen altar, the perfection of which is contextualized by Christ's most perfect priestly sacrifice. As high priest, Christ perfects the Holocaust offering on the altar of our nature. Recall that for Aquinas, a priest is a mediator between God and the people who bestows divine things on the people, offering their prayers to God and atoning for their sins. As formed from the earth, this altar also stands as a symbol of the new creation that is wrought in Christ. As the first Adam was formed from the clay of the earth, so too is the new Adam formed in his members through the sacrificial mediation of the incarnate Word. And now the sacraments of baptism in order as such participations. As one of three sacraments that confer both character and sacramental grace, baptism is related to Christ's priesthood in both of its effects. By conferring its twofold effect, for Aquinas, baptism conforms its recipient to Christ's passion and resurrection, actions that he argues are intrinsically connected to the exercise of the priestly character of Christ's ministry. In the case of sacramental character, however, baptismal character gives the power to participate in the Church's liturgy, most especially the Mass, and to receive the life of grace from this participation. Understood in this way, the character of baptism gives the believer access to the space of the temple, in which their own humanity becomes an instrument of the priestly headship of Christ. In the case of orders, we find that a different sacramental character configures its recipient in a different relationship with Christ as head and priest. As a sacrament, orders is one of two sacraments that perfect what Aquinas refers to as the social dimension of the human person. The first being marriage, which perfects the social order in a natural sense. The priesthood is related to the social whole of the Church herself. Aquinas argues that, speaking generally, an individual person can be perfected with respect to the common good by being given the office to rule over the community and by the ability to perform public acts. In the specific case of the priesthood, in addition to exercising governance over the Church as a body, Aquinas believes that priestly acts of sacrifice are inherently public in character, directed towards the mystical body of the Church as a whole. In support of this, he cites the text of Hebrews 7:27, which describes priests as offering sacrifice not only for themselves, but for the people as well. Both baptism and orders have a twofold effect in the form of grace and character. The first of these effects, sanctifying grace, of which so-called sacramental grace is a mode, according to the later Thomistic tradition. This first dimension affects the supernatural perfectibility of human acts themselves, most generally considered. In this regard, the sacrifice of charity best fulfills the type of the Holocaust offering, as Aquinas indicated in his treatment of the figurative sense of the threefold sacrifices offered under the Old Law. The secondary sacramental effect, however, concerns the liturgy and liturgical action more specifically. As a subset of moral activity more generally conceived, sacramental character enables a distinct set of human actions that concern the Church's liturgical life, by modifying the power of the intellect in an unchangeable manner, so that the person may act as an instrument of divine power, participating as an instrumental cause in the formality of the principal agent, which is the priesthood of Christ himself. Both baptism and the sacrament of orders exemplify this conversion to Christ through sacramental character, although according to different modes. So, some conclusions and reflections on contemporary implications. In the preceding sections of this lecture, I have outlined a reading of Aquinas on the priesthood that takes its departure from the relationship of human nature to God, understood within the unfolding context of salvation history. Although often presented within the context of his systematic theology, I hope that I have shown here that the conceptual roots of Aquinas' theological approach to the priesthood are in fact accessible on both natural and biblical grounds. In this regard, I have not intended to invoke any of the two common dichotomies between biblical and systematic methodologies in theological discourse that have been paradigmatic for many iterations of post-liberal Protestant and ressourcement Catholic theologies during the late 19th and 20th centuries. My aim here has not been to distance Aquinas' theology of the priesthood or any other aspect of his theological synthesis from his speculative or philosophical commitments, of course. However, I do believe that fresh readings of Aquinas that offer new points of entry into his thought can provide points of entry for modern and now postmodern perspectives. The danger of esotericism will always haunt an approach to Aquinas' account of nature and the human person that insists on what is often received as a narrow intellectual tribalism, as the necessary prolegomena to any future theological discourse. Although modernity and its many postmodern declensions present a wide array of intellectual perspectives, not always compatible with each other, a turn towards subjectivity, perception, and anthropology characterizes many trends of thought within these broad categories, ranging from the rationalism of early modernity to 20th century phenomenology. Although direct engagements with the perspectives of Descartes, Heidegger, and others on philosophical grounds remains necessary, Aquinas' thought can also provide a wide array of conceptual grammars for other forms of engagement with these same perspectives. At the outset, this lecture began by remarking that in his account of Sacra Doctrina, Aquinas identifies a human need, not entirely post-lapsarian, for a divine pedagogy that is not only intellectually informative, but salvific and restorative as well. In the virtue of religion, a fundamental principle within human nature is uncovered that provides the means for orienting both the internal and external acts of the human person towards the one God in acts that reestablish the creature's relationship with the Creator in justice and offer God fitting praise. These internal and external acts, comprised as they are of the interior immateriality of the rational intellect and the exterior reality of physical things, movements, and gestures, forms the basis for reimagining the individual and social space of human nature in new ways. The pattern of the temple, according to its letter, offers a sacral reconfiguration of this space within the natural teleology of the human person, that not only navigates around the pitfalls of disingenuous and dystelic versions of human religiosity, but also begins the ultimate fulfillment of this same religious teleology by filling these spaces with the living faith of Abraham. In the context of grace, this same human space receives its consummating perfection in the religious activity of Christ's priesthood, no longer in figure, but in reality. The doctrines of sacramentality, sanctifying grace, and sacramental character of both baptism and orders are revelatory and therefore biblical before they are speculative. The postmodern interest in anthropological resources for thinking about the sacralization of human space, both personal and social, provides a point of entree for reintroducing these aspects of Aquinas' thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Reginald.